Beginner's Guide to React Class Components, State, Event Handling, and Props. We'd like to look at class components for the reason in that you might be on React, more legacy React 16. You might not have the privilege of having the most modern React on a project, so you'd have to know how to go about creating a class component which would give you state to work with. In this tutorial, we're just going to quickly go through that, explain what a class component is, the state mechanism, how props work, and pretty much build your first class component. So I've already taken the liberty of running some commands, and specifically the mpx node package manager, where you would use, I have a very long file path here, where you'd use create React app, whatever your directory name is. Create React app or CRA will go and scaffold out this project I've already created, and then after it's scaffolded out, you would go into the directory, and then you'd run npm start, and that would kick off our React dev environment. So I've already gone through that steps already. You can see here I have the project already configured, and I'm just using a different tab here. So if I were to go back, I've already run the scaffolded React app in the browser. I know it's running. I know it's ready to go, and we can start building out some components. So our first component will be just a hello world type component. So if we briefly take a look at the structure, again, we have node modules, the public folder, which is the entry point to our React app in index.html. Again, it has that root node that gets rendered by our index.jss. This is where all the React DOM actually is. I'm going to look for the root element and then inject our app into it. And the entry point for our application is this app.jsx component. So that's all well and good. We have the boilerplate code that just pretty much our app here, and that's all well and good, but we might not need all of that. So for now, we'll just leave that until we start building this out, and then we'll remove it. Normally what I like to do, just force a habit, just for organizational purposes. You don't have to do this, but I always like to have a components folder, and then within that, using Visual Studio Code, I'll create hello world.jsx, and then I'm building out my first component, right? So I'm going to import in React from React, and that's been installed already. And I'm just going to create a class component this time. Instead of a functional component, I need to use that ES6 syntax for class that comes with the JavaScript markup from the big update in 2015. It still needs to be Pascal case, meaning each word is capitalized, and we need to extend this from React.component. And then we need to, just to follow the pattern, we need to export this guy, export default hello world, so that our component is visible to the outside world. That's usually a good step to do. And normally in our class component, it acts like a class. So like there will be a constructor. That's where the setup happens. It's like the initializer when the component is first initialized or mounted. If there's nothing really going on in terms of setting up state or anything you need to do, if you don't really need it, you can remove it. It will be quietly there. Just know that if you're using a class component, you're using the constructor, because this class inherits or is derived from this parent class React component. That's the parent or super class. Anytime you're making a child class, you just have to follow the pattern where you have a constructor and you need to call the superclass, especially when props are involved. Now, I have ESLint installed. This is basically telling me that you have an unneeded, useless constructor. It's not doing anything, so there's no setup there. So you really don't need to define it, knowing that it quietly is in the background. But more on that later. So if we have this class component, this is the parent. Remember the parent class, which holds the blueprint. Internally, it has all of the functionality that a class component doesn't have, like ability to render. Some kind of state management, some kind of life cycle. That's what you're getting when you're using a class component. Internally, it will also have a method for rendering. So every child that inherits from React component needs to also have a render method. So we can give it a simple render method. And what I mean render method is it looks a little bit different than our traditional functions. You could use an arrow function, but you can't define it in this way. Like you can't const render equal to an arrow function. That's not really gonna fly in here, right? I mean, the render may allow you to do that, but I mean, traditionally the pattern is usually sort of like a method that exists in a class. And what it's barking at me now is it's saying, okay, you need to have a return statement because it needs to return at least something, even if it's just a React fragment. As simple as that. Every component that is a React component needs to render something. And then we can just hello world. And we'll expand this a little bit more. Now if by the way, sorry, in my initial example, I had div tags as the parent tag. And then I had, I had this as a header, H1, just to make it a little bit bigger and kind of move around this text here so that when we actually render this, it's a little bit more prominent. And I'll get back to why we use a React fragment in a moment. So here's our little hello world. I have this exposed to the world, so I need to go back to my entry point app.js, and I can remove all of this if I want to. I don't need to keep any of these styles. This will affect the page on the right once I remove this. I should put at least some JSX to render. And if I save that, you can see on the right it hot reloaded, and there's nothing there. But what we want to do is we want to first import that component. So use an import statement, import hello world. It can autocomplete. If I press tab, I should be able to get the file path generated for me, components. Again, it's barking at me, my ESLint, saying, hey, you declared this component, but it's never read. So we should go ahead in the middle of this. When I save that, you can see that it re-renders. If we go with our DevTools and inspect this particular, and we inspect what the DOM looks like, we can see the markup there, and it has the root tag, which we know is the entry point. It has all these extra div tags, which, like we mentioned before in the JSX tutorial, they're not needed. They're polluting the DOM. I could use that. So we can look back in the DOM here, and you can see now our root tag is there, and so we're kind of getting there. If we go back to the hello world, I can also use this as a fragment here. So I will quickly save that, and you can see it's cleaned up. That fragment, like I said, is short form. In this component, I have React defined. So if I said React.fragment, and then also React.fragment, it's the same thing. It's just it does no different. Just the kind of empty tag and close empty tag is short form, shorthand for React.fragment. If you want to be explicit or not, that's just kind of a personal choice for JSX and using fragments in general. So next up, what we want to do is we want to add state to this because we have a very static component. It'd be more suited to be a functional component. There's no reason to have a class component for this purpose here, just to render hello world. We would want to be a little bit more dynamic. So we could pass in a name, and maybe perhaps it would output first name, last name. We do that. First of all, we need to, much like a class component, or sorry, a functional component, we want to pass props in before we even get to state. So props is just a way to pass data from one component to another. Props is unidirectional from parent down to child. You can't go back up, but it's just a way of sharing data between components. So if I wanted to, very simply just add an attribute onto this JSX for, we'll just call it message. And I want this message to be just my name. That's all. It can be anything. But as soon as I'm putting that attribute on there, I'll have access to that in forms of in the prop object. So that in the class component, I could actually reference this on the object props.message. And anything else I add in here, if it was last name, and if you notice, I'm wrapping it in that interpolation, those curly braces, that'll make it evaluate whatever's inside of it. So it'll know that when it hits this is actually a value to pass through to the props there, and one is not really needed for us. But we can say hello world, hello React. And then on the flip side there, since we're using a class component, now this is a good reason to use our constructor, because now we don't just have that basic constructor. We do actually have props involved. So there is some initialization. Just following that pattern, if we have a constructor, we need to call the super. This is useless right now because that's what's defined in the background anyhow. But I'd like to actually pass through the props. So I would say props. And if I'm passing this to the child component, I need to also let the parent know about props. And again, right now, this is also defined in the background. I'm not really doing anything extra here. I'm just there's no benefit to having this since it already is set up in this way. But we are going to initialize some state in here. So we do want this constructor involved. For the most part, let's just put this here. We'll just quickly use our curly braces here. And remember, we can do props.message. And if you notice, when I did that, it auto-completed it for me. Because we're using a class component and it's an instance of a class, it has a keyword of this, meaning this particular instance. If there's 100 hello world components, this keyword refers to this particular instance, so that across those 100 components, there could be different messages. So this.props.message, if I save that, you can see quickly it did respect the prop change. Hello React. Hello, good day to you, whatever. Press save, you can see that's updated automatically. So now we have props coming in, which is great. That's what you want. But next we'd actually like to add a little bit of state to this. And if we're going to add state, this is where the setup would help us out, because this is like when the component is first initialized. So here's where we're going to initialize. And because we're using React components, we have this concept called state. The way to access it is, again, through this keyword, this.state. And we're going to initialize it to an object. It is an object by default, but we're going to say that the initial message is going to be whatever we want to call it. We can just call it the initial message is just hello world again. And that's initial state that we're setting up. We have props.message, which is coming in through the props. And we have this internal message. We could certainly just leave this as the internal message, and that one's from the props. We can change, if we wanted to change the name of the prop just to be, I don't know, what do you want to call it? You could call it user message, right? Or we'll leave this one as message here. And this is going to be triggered by the user anyhow, so we could just call this user message if we wanted to. just to signal the difference that one is coming through props and is read-only, and this one is going to change via some kind of user action. So we can put this right here. So we're going to do another h1 tag, and we are going to use the curly braces, and then we're going to output that state message. That is, you wrap it in those curly braces or mustaches. Use this keyword, this state user message. I know I've called it message before. It's the same thing, really, if we just want to do a comparison. So you can see there, hello React and hello world. I mean, just for clarity, we could wrap this guy and just say hello React, and we could just say from props. And you can see that one is from props, this one is from the internal. I mean, whichever one helps you out the most, right? So this is it. We have one that is from state internally, and then one that is from the outside, which is the read-only props, internal state. It's any interaction. I mean, this is what it is. It's just kind of two different ways of displaying a message. But in order to make this a bit more interesting and to make our components interesting, we need to be able to capture, some type of user event or user action, right? Like a click of a button. So many user interfaces nowadays are very event driven, so we need mechanisms to be able to handle events in React. It's what you might think. So if we had, we'll just add a button here, and the button is pretty static by itself. HTML button. It's going to just say change message, and we can kind of space this out a little bit if we want to. And we're going to change, our target is to not change the prop message, but to change the internal user message. So we have a button right there. When I save it, you can see here, it's a tiny little button here. When I click it, it does nothing. So we want to be able to at least create a mechanism to handle that click. I can collapse this constructor for now if I want to. And I want to create another handler. We can call it handle change message. We can just call it change message if we wanted to. And that is a method. I mean, you could put a little arrow if you wanted on it. If you so desired to do that, if you wanted to make it like an arrow function, you could do that. It's the same thing as having a method. And what I mean by that is it's the same thing as writing it in this way. Defined, and then with the braces, however you want to do it. I'll just leave it. Well, you know what? I'll use that little arrow syntax if we're used to that for functional components. Since I'm in the window, I could actually call it an alert. Clicked. So when I call this function, I'll get the alert message. At least I know it's wired up. And how you wire it up in React is you need to use a click handler. Traditionally in HTML, the click handler would all be lowercase, but you can see in my autocomplete, React wants that camel case, being the first. It starts with a lowercase, and that first word is lowercase, and every new word has an uppercase, so it looks like a bit of a hump on click. And then you need to, you're gonna try to wire it to something. So we can have, we use that expression, and we need to use this keyword, this dot change message, right? So that it wires up this handler, this function, to the click mechanism. We're not invoking it like this, because if we were to automatically, if you notice the DOM is not doing anything, right? It's loaded up by reference. It will only fire if I click this. You can see now it triggers. But because I am passing it by reference here, I'm basically loading it up to be only fired when somebody clicks. If I were to use that function invocation, meaning the two parentheses, that would actually call it right away. If I save this, you'll see right away when the page loaded, it was already there. And it's always there. Anytime I try to clear it, well, now it went away, but when I click the button again, it will never trigger because it's already fired and closed. So there's no way to bring it back now because there is no reference anymore to it. We defined it and we fired it right away, and now it's gone. So we want it bound, and this is something called binding. So we're basically deferring it to be called only when the action click happens, and then forever it'll be bound to this action, right? So we know it works. This is what we want. We want a handler, and we want to handle some user action. And then, you know what? Perhaps this would have been time to actually, clarify this example a little bit more. We'll create a greeter component, just a greeter or greeting.jsx component. And in that component is exactly the same. This one's just going to be a static component. So we can quickly define this. Quickly import React from React. This component is just going to take the place of that static text, just to kind of simplify things a little bit. So we're just extending from React.component again. Just force a habit, we're going to export it by default, the greeting component. We know that constructor is there with props, and we know that we don't need that if we're not doing anything with it, so we don't need to do that. Every functional component has a render method, and inside every render method is expecting to return some type of JSX. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to return in a smaller header, h2. I'm going to just put in there this props.message. And I'm purposely creating an error here, by the way. And you'll see it in a minute. I'm going to go back and get rid of this prop. And I'm going to import that greeter component, import greeting from greeter. I kind of spelt it wrong. I'm going to use it here above. So I have my greeting component. I'm going to close that tag off, and I'm going to grab this prop because I want the greeter just to be static, and I want the hello world to be dynamic with its internal state. So if I save this guy now, and you'll see the problem that I did there was that I have this .props.message, and it's not defining, it's not evaluating what I passed in there. And of course, it's because I'm missing those curly braces, which means evaluate this variable. So if I need React to tell React, I need to tell React that this .props.message is not just text to be rendered, it is actually something to be evaluated. And when it evaluates it, it knows that it's actually defined on this props object, and it was passed in, like there is a value to render, and that's React from props. So now we have a static component. We can go back to our dynamic component that has some state. Now we don't really need the props, but we can keep them there. Like we can keep that there. That's fine for future use. But we don't need this anymore, right? So we don't. The greeter component's taking care of that hello, or that text hello React. I don't have the hello there, but I could certainly put that back if I wanted to. Hello React from props, hello world from internal state. And next up, I just want to be able to show that if I click this, it doesn't just fire an alert. It will actually change my state, my message. That's what we want. And we're all set up to do that, really. We just have to modify the state somehow. We can't modify it directly, meaning, you can keep this in here if you want. If it's too annoying, you can actually it's a good debugging to put a console log in there and just say, button clicked, change message, just so you know where you are. And you can dump a lot of things out. And what that does there, it's a little bit less intrusive. So if I look in my console log and I clear, whatever's happening in there, if I click change message, I can see that my message is being clicked and tracked. So very simply, all I want to do here is I want to change state now somehow. How do I change and update state? Right? I want to do it here. The first inclination would be like, I have this dis.state variable. That's a message. And you know what? I don't like the fact it's user message anymore, because now we have the greeter component that's taking care of that. So I'm going to change this internal message back to message, because it's private internal to this object. No outside entity can change it because this is private. And let's prove that it works first. I'll save that change. Everything seems to be working fine. And like I said, the first inclination is you might want to just directly try to change the state to something else, right? We might want to say goodbye, right? And what this is supposed to do, my expectation is when I click this button, this hello world internal state is going to be to change to goodbye. But you can see that the button is firing, but nothing's happening. This is the wrong way to set up state, because it's just probably trying to overwrite. It's trying to change state and not in a good way, and React is not updating. Nothing is re-rendering, nothing is triggering. So the inner workings of React is not firing. What we need to do very simply in one line here is use the mechanism that is available to all class components that come along for the ride when you're using React.component, much like this .state is available to us. We have the mechanism that changes state, and it's not directly like this. What it is it's if you use this keyword and the dot notation, you will see on it a bunch of methods in the API that are coming from the component.react. There's some lifecycle like mounting and updating, which we'll talk about a little bit more. And then there's this render method that we already are using. And then there is this set state. So set state is what we want. And that is what is going to give us our expected behavior. And all we need to do here is, give it what it needs. And usually because we define state as an object, it's going to expect an object. And what we want to do inside of there is we just want to change what the message is now. So we want to say the message is going to be now goodbye. If I save this now, everything loads. When I click the button now, you can see it changed. What we want, which is what we want. And because we're using this .set state, React component and the inner workings of React will modify state. And when state is modified in the UI tree, it forces all these components to re-render. And when it re-renders, then this little snippet here will actually render again. And when it evaluates this .state.message, it's going to pick up what is current state, which is now goodbye. That is all I did. If I keep clicking this, the state does not change, although it's smart enough to know there's no difference there and reconciles that. But, if I had a counter, if I had some way of incrementing this guy here, then it would actually update state and re-render. Yeah, right now we basically have the initial message, and then it changes on click. In order to build a counter or more sophisticated things, then we need to do more than just a hard-coded string. I mean, we could certainly do a random string here or a random message, and it would change every time. But because it's static right now, it'll only say goodbye on click. So anyhow, that's a class component with some props passed in, but we deferred to the static component that use props, and we pass them in through this main app.js. Then we had our dynamic hello world that when we set it up, we initialized state. We outputted the state, this .state message. Then we wanted a way to change state, so we added a button with event handler on click. And within that on click message here, we used the mechanism this.set state to change the state and re-render the DOM, the virtual DOM, and get the behavior we're looking for. So that's class components in a nutshell. They are a little bit more syntax than traditional functional components. They give you the state control you need. But when we do React 18, then we're introduced to React hooks. React hooks will allow our functional components to act in this way. But it's good to know about classical class components. And we'll continue on and learn more about React hooks in future tutorials.